Hello everyone, this is Caillou, and welcome back to Month 1. This is a series of videos in which I go over the impact that Blood Like Rivers has had on the Revolution format during its first month in the format. If those words make no sense to you, well, Revolution is a custom card constructed format for the game of Magic the Gathering. It's made up of 6 custom sets, and it's made to emulate a standard-esque format. You can find out more about brewing and playing with the format in the description. Blood Like Rivers is the latest set to be added to the format. It was added a month ago, and since then has had a significant impact on the meta of the entire format. While my other videos in this series are going to be talking about top 10 lists of some of the most impactful and least impactful cards from that set, in this video I want it to be a general overview of what the meta is like, 1 month into the BLR release. The idea of this video is hopefully it'll give you a rundown of decks that you should expect to see in a tournament setting, or should have a plan to beat if you're going into a tournament setting. We have monthly tournaments. We have tournaments each month, starting on the 7th of each month. I will say, as with all custom formats, because of the player base, the idea of a meta, quote unquote, is usually just the decks that people are playing, and that can be one or a few people. The goal of this video is to go over not only some of the decks that are commonly played, but also some of the potent engines that are available and have been tested / that people are aware of and might bring in the future. This is by no means an extensive coverage of what is possible to play in the format, and I encourage you, if you're a brewer, to check out, I'm going to be linking in the description, our search engine manifesto, which will allow you to go through and, using Scryfall as queries, look through all the cards in the format and perhaps brew something of your own. But yeah, even if you are a brewer, hopefully this gives you an idea of what the field will look like / maybe there is a better card for the plan that you're having that you haven't considered before. But without further ado, we're going to start off by looking at some mid-range decks. And I think there is no more iconic mid-range deck to Revolution right now than Black X Midrange. So this is a series of related decks that all have focus on the same core of powerful black cards. This starts with powerful black 2-drops. Skarn essentially wins every single combat and provides inevitability, allowing you to stall against aggressive decks. Smirk's 2/3 body is also very good against aggressive decks, and she generates a lot of card advantage just by sticking around. Meanwhile, Reinstated Reaper is on the aggressive end and allows you to just mow through opponents if it's left unanswered. Speaking of answers, Black also has access to some of the best removal in the format. Fatal Flaw misses very few creatures. It's one of the best catch-all removal spells in the format, and being instant speed doesn't hurt either. And Crucify and Twilight Ambush are both great at being 1-mana quote-unquote removal spells that can clean up and take out some of the other strong threats in the format. Finally, Black X Midrange gets its power from its overwhelming 4-drop suite. Trezak can come down and stabilize the game by himself, especially versus midrange, where the life payment probably won't matter when they no longer have a board. Merkalt's lifelink is one of the best stabilization tools in the entire format. There are very few ways to consistently gain life in a way that isn't actively hurting your deck's plan. Merkalt is one of them. And being a 6/6 lifelink menace, once your opponent has less than 10 life, means that you can just close out games efficiently. Finally, High Desecrator Nicholas provides inevitability that the other two don't, while also not being a creature and therefore not being hit by removal. So overall, with these 3 sets of powerful cards that come together to form a core, Black Midrange both has an advantage in getting on the board early, having strong interaction, and then being able to stabilize in the mid game and put out consistently strong threats. Now, I say Black X because usually these decks do not go mono black. They're splashing for some other threats. One popular recent variation is Black Red for the 3-drop suite of Conjoined Irradiant and Partners in Crime. Partners in Crime scaled very powerfully, and it and Conjoined Irradiant together are very efficient ways of turning on one of the best removal spells in the format, Ferocious Flame. which helps the aggressive bent of black-red. The main reason to run black-red, though, is Lucille. She's a damage doubler on a 6 power haste body for 5 mana. You can curve into her from one of the treasure bros, and she also turns Ferocious Flame from a mere 4 damage removal spell into 1 mana instant speed, deal 8 to face. Of course, her downside is you really need to be able to kill your opponent the turn she comes down, or they might just be able to kill you on the backswing. However, together, these 3 sets of cards, the Treasure Bros, Conjoined Radiant Partners in Crime, Ferocious Flame, and Lucille, make going into black-red a very viable option. Another powerful shell is black-white, which makes use of Half-Heart's Claim. Half-Heart's Claim essentially Siege Rhinos and ETB allows you to recur some of your cheap creatures and also take out any non-land permanent with mana value 3 or less. This like Saga-esque value engine from the campaign makes it really easy to break stalls in the mid game versus other mid-range decks, stabilize versus aggro, and usually just outvalue your opponent in a way that black-red sometimes struggles with its purely aggressive bent. Black-red and the black core also form, are present in another one of the strong mid-range decks in the format. We're going to be looking at Jund next. Now, Jund is different from black-red / the other black mid-range decks due to its access to green 2-mana ramp. Elvish Witness and Explore both have their own niches, but together they form a really strong way to be able to drop like the potent black 4-drops that we saw earlier on turn 3, and that can sometimes just run away with the game. There's also some green-specific 4-drops that are strong. Tugay Corpse Maker does a pretty decent Chupacabra impression, especially with its better stat line and in the late game, the ability to just drop it and 4-for-1 your opponent. Force of the Tugay, meanwhile, while not as impressive on its face as some of the other cards, has insane inevitability and therefore is really strong against any sort of controlling matchup and is great versus mid-range mirrors as well, because it makes it so that your opponent can no longer profitably just trade 1-for-1. Another strength of Jund relative to black-red and other black mid-range decks is the Ancient Core. So Ancient is a mechanic from Bloodlike Rivers, which cares about you having 8 or more lands in both in your battlefield and graveyard combined. Old Ways Advocate plus Gift of the Deadwoods provides a powerful Stompy Core, which lets you outsize some of the other mid-range decks, and as a result, you can more profitably win combats and enable Lucille endgames. Of course, you don't have to be in black if you want to play mid-range. Next up, we're going to be looking at Real Shark, which is a deck named after its 2 primary engines, the first of which is Real Silver Rose General. Real is incredibly powerful, essentially being a 3-mana Panharmonicon that you can trigger on creatures you already control, and being a 3/2 with First Strike means that it's very difficult to lose combat with her. And you combine this with the backbreaking ETB from Rogue Palace Card Shark, which essentially allows you to do a mock Collected Company / Factor Fiction variant, where if you build your deck right, Rogue's Palace Card Shark is your only 4 mana or higher card, and the rest of the cards in your deck are 3 mana or less permanents. So you can be guaranteed strong hits off Rogue Palace Card Shark each time, and then just keep reusing it to outvalue your opponents. One of the weaknesses of black mid-range decks is that they, because of being on the more aggressive side, they have a lot of haymakers, but they don't have a lot of ways to generate excess card advantage in the late game if you can answer some of their potent engines. Both Jund and Real Shark can just go over the top of them. Some of the ways that Real Shark enables this is through powerful green-white 2-drops. Crystal Line enables a turn 3 Card Shark, or can just grow into a 3/2 Vigilance Trample on 2, which is hard for lots of decks to deal with. Silver Rose Visionary is just a simple cantripping creature that, if you can start quote-unquote flickering it with Real, just generates an excess of value. And Tugay Rallier naturally scales really well. Um, it provides 3/2 worth of stats on its own over 2 bodies, and once you start reusing its ETB, it can make your board grow into an absolutely unstoppable force. Another card that helps you find your engines is Ardent Ascetic. Being able to dig 4 deep for any permanent card and play a bunch of lands means that you can turbo out all of your lands from your hand, while also trying to find a Real so that you can immediately reuse the Ardent Ascetic next turn. And its 4 toughness means that even though you're not going to be getting in damage with Ardent Ascetic, you're very rarely going to lose it by attacking. So overall, Real Shark is one of the potent mid-range decks in the format that can just go over the top with pure value, thanks to the combination of Real Silver Rose General and Rogue's Palace Card Shark. The next potent value engine we're going to be looking at is in a Bant deck. It's going to be Bant In Search of Peace. The titular card In Search of Peace allows you to, whenever you cast a spell, slow flicker a permanent. Obviously, again, we're getting back into really powerful flicker shenanigans over here. And it has a very similar core. Like lots of the cards that you see, that you saw from the Card Shark core, are going to be present in an In Search of Peace deck. One thing that is a little bit different is the presence of Unknowable Starspawn. Being able to go up to 5 means that you can more consistently get some real haymakers, and Starspawn is one of the best flicker targets in the format. Conventional wisdom in Magic the Gathering says effects that let your opponent choose / punisher effects aren't as good as they look. Unfortunately for your opponents, a Noble Starspawn is the real deal, and there's very rarely a condition that they can choose that won't just result in them quickly getting outvalued and overrun. I mean, if they have no creatures to sacrifice, well, okay, then you just swing in with your 5/4. They have no cards in hand, well, that's still fine because that means you're probably out card advantaging them. And of course, if they're ever choosing the drain 4, they'll just die very, very quickly. Another engine that isn't present in either of these decks, but I feel like should be mentioned, is Herald of the Wild Court. Herald of the Wild Court is notable for just being another new powerful engine from Bloodlike Rivers that people are experimenting with. It hasn't quite found a shell in the same way that In Search of Peace and Real Shark have, but it is very much worth building around. I won't have a list for it in the description, but I think that you can pretty easily cannibalize the other 2 lists, the In Search of Peace and the Naya Real Shark list, into a Herald of the Wild Court list if that's your jam. There's also a final mid-range deck we're going to be looking at, and this one leans more controlling because it's very creature-light. It's going to be Essence Remade Enchantments. Essence Remade is an extremely powerful Neoform variant that is, essentially allows you to Neoform any permanent. This allows you to play an enchantment toolbox deck that takes 1-drop enchantments like Kaleidoscape, which just cantrip and help you fix in the early game, and turn them into a bevy of powerful 2-drop enchantments. Dooming Door, which is essentially just an edict, Asahi's Final Front, which allows you to cantrip and gain some life, and then Grovelet Meditation, which has powerful stabilizing / ramp implications. And then obviously, if you have a 2-drop, you can just Essence Remade this into In Search of Peace, and then start flickering some of your 2-drops to just go way over the top. Now, I will mention that Essence Remade, since it doesn't specify a permanent type, you can have a variety of chains. In our most recent GP, there was a person playing even a Planeswalker chain, where you would go from 4 to 5 to 6, and obviously you can also play this in some of the other creature-based shells as well. The most difficult part of Essence Remade is generally the mana. You don't really want a blue mana in some of your other mid-range decks, and in the deck where you would want it, like Bant In Search of Peace, you usually don't need a toolbox because you're just going to be valuing. But overall, Essence Remade is just a very powerful card to build around / brew around, so don't feel restricted by any of the cards mentioned today, and feel free to look up for some exciting chains on Manifesto. Next up, we're going to be moving into control decks. Essence Remade is sort of between a mid-range and control deck, but now we're getting into some real hard control decks. First up is Esper Control. So Esper Control has some niches. Obviously, we mentioned some of the powers of black removal earlier. One thing to know about this format is that it really isn't a counterspell control format. Lots of these decks will play counterspells on the side, but generally these decks, even if they are draw go control decks, are going to be playing a lot more cheap removal. The reason for this is we saw with some of the earlier, even the mid-range decks, they play to the board very early, and so and since we don't have like 2-mana counterspells that are agnostic in the same way as a format like Modern might, there really isn't a good way to allow, like, you can't just allow decks to get under you, and playing 3-mana counterspells when your opponent is potentially just curving out 2-3 before you can do anything means that you really need to have some way to control the board rather than answer hard threats. Of course, in slower matchups, they will bring in counterspells. With that little aside, one thing that white brings to the table is Banish to the Ice. Unlike the black removal suite, Banish to the Ice misses nothing. It exiles, which is very relevant for some of the cards like Force of the Tuge, which have graveyard implications, or Lucille, which has escape. And the far-off lands, fixing them is quite relevant in the current format, especially with some of the greedier 3-color decks, but is often a worthwhile price to pay to just point-and-click kill anything. Access to white is also very strong because we have 2 potent 4-mana wipes, which again, with how board-centric the meta is right now, having access to a lot of wipes for control decks is a great boon. Esper Control also has access to Jorah, who is one of the best straight-up win cons in the format. He stabilizes incredibly well thanks to his +2 gaining you life. The -3 exiling graveyards is a very particular meta call because of how graveyard-focused decks just tend to be in general. And while the alt is usually trinket text, if you do manage to get to it, it is just game over for your opponents. And he pluses up there very quickly. The other control deck we're going to be talking about is Sultai Vibrant Control. Now, the power of lots of the mid-range decks is they kind of go toe-to-toe with each other really well. They have good interaction. They have powerful value engines. Vibrant Control aims to say, I'm going to play it a little slower, but that doesn't matter because I will inevitably just go over the top of any other deck in the format. And it achieves this through the use of Vibrant Vengeance, the titular card. Vibrant Vengeance, being a -2/-2 wipe, is relevant, though not as much as it might seem because of the existence of scaling threats like Reinstated Reaper and Partners in Crime, and also cards with just 3 toughness like Smirk. However, it is a reasonable way to clean up some creatures, and its backbreaking ability to do the Mirari's Wake mana doubling means that you just have an insane amount of mana advantage relative to any other deck. This mana advantage can be leveraged into cards like the Revelations. Revelations are sorceries that you can essentially flashback from your graveyard, and you get a creature on the flashback. This turns stuff like your cheap removal and your strategic planning / cantrips into potent late game win cons, and just gives you value that your opponents can't outdo. Sultai also gives access to Xerix, who is arguably the best planeswalker in the format right now, though there are definitely others that give it a run for his money, like Jorah, and one that we haven't mentioned here, Asahi. Xerix just being able to +7 on the turn they come down means that killing them in combat is pretty difficult. It has the classic value on a plus, removal on a minus, and the alt just means that for a control deck, you just instantly win the game. But yeah, Xerix is just an archetypal planeswalker, but in a way that is very powerful for control decks. Finally, the ace in the hole for Sultai Vibrant Vengeance Control is Captivating Dreams. In long games, the ability of Captivating Dreams to provide this threat that you just cannot escape from because it puts itself back into your library means that the threat of even milling out Sultai Control isn't really viable because they will eventually just keep hitting Captivating Dreams and take an infinite number of turns or a sufficiently large number of turns to simply kill you. One thing to note for both of these control decks is that Blood-like Rivers has added creature lands into the format, which allows you to play a lot more stripped down in terms of your win cons. Obviously, we've shown off some potent win cons here in terms of the Planeswalkers, Revelations, Captivating Dreams, but being aware that creature lands do exist is something that if you're playing control or playing against a control, or playing mid-range or playing against mid-range, is something to be aware of. With that, we're done with the control decks. Let's get into aggro. So Scrap Aggro is sort of the you must be this tall. It is mono red with a twist, effectively. The 1-drops are pretty simple. They're just there to provide something on your curve that can dish out damage. The 2-drops is where you get a little spicy. Unrivaled Slayer is, with the first strike haste, is just a powerful beater. The alternate cost does come up sometimes, but really you're just playing it as a haster that can't really be beat in combat. Talented Blacksmith and Emgaran Duelist, however, Emgaran Duelist scales really well. It's another one of the scaling threats in the format, but its ability to create treasure tokens and Talented Blacksmith creating glyphs are both really relevant for what is arguably the best aggro card in the format, Blood Frenzied Vanguard. Blood Frenzied Vanguard, being a ball lightning that doesn't actually sacrifice itself if you've sacrificed a permanent, means that all of a sudden, having scrap, quote unquote, throw away artifacts, allows you to just really put your opponent in a spot where, I can't really answer this 5-mana haste trample that just has dinged me for 8 damage over 2 turns. I blocked it, but now I'm 8 damage out. And it also means your opponent kind of can never be safe / never stabilize in a meaningful way because you always have the potential of 5 haste just ready to be thrown at their face. Most Scrap Aggro decks are mono-red. The mono-red version plays a curve up to 3. There is a red-white version which splashes for Assemble the Mob, another powerful Revolt card. It's basically Raise the Alarm, except on Revolt, it Brushwhackers, which is insane, because on its own, that means that it's a 4 damage swing. But its ability to scale with your other creatures and give other creatures haste that might not otherwise if you play this on turn 4 is incredibly potent, and a reason to look at the deck. And if you're willing to go up to 4, the deck can often index into Scourge of the Spine as another powerful hasty threat that decks really have trouble answering. It being able to be another 5 haste, 5 flying haste, and potentially even stick around if you have spare artifacts, is really backbreaking for other decks. And obviously, both Blood Frenzied Vanguard and Scourge of the Spine having more than 4 power is relevant for Ferocious Flame, which is one of the best burn spells in the format. Or actually is just the best burn spell in the format, really. Finally, the last deck we're going to be talking about is Blue-Red Prowess. What Scrap Aggro has in terms of consistency and the ability to dish out damage over time, Prowess Aggro makes up for with its incredible blitz potential. Prowess Aggro has 3 really powerful 1-drops that you can curve out from, but its real strength comes from Sprite Dragon. Everyone knows about this card's power from Canon, and even in this format, you have powerful cantrips. Opt and Eavesdrop just are standard powerful cantrips. Realize Delicate Ideal, it being a revelation, means that it also provides some late game consistency. The main issue with the deck is if your Draconic Aspirant or your Sprite Dragon get taken out early into the game by a removal spell, or get taken out in response to you pumping them or whatever, you can lose a lot of steam very quickly, and it can be hard to recover. Obviously, the presence of cantrips and the aforementioned revelation in Realize a Delicate Ideal help, One of the other big boons is Freeze Fire Corpse, essentially just drawing you a card on every attack. Uh, but one thing to be aware of is just that prowess is definitely a lot more fragile than Scrap Aggro, despite it having some tools to play the longer game. Um, but overall, those are the main decks to be aware of in Revolution right now. Uh, I'll have links to potential deck lists for all of these archetypes in the description. Also, remember, like I mentioned at the top of the show, these are just decks to be aware of and to have plans for. You don't have to play one of these decks to succeed, and in fact, it is very possible to succeed on a list that features maybe even none of the cards talked about here today. These are just some cards that are strong to be aware of and to have a plan for. But feel free to brew your own decks. As always, custom formats have a reasonable player basis, but they're small enough that you can usually break out with your own brews, which is part of the fun, honestly. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed this meta breakdown. Until next month, this is Caillou signing off.